One radar blip, one nervous commander, one decision that cannot be taken back. In the narrow stretch of sea between Japan and China, steel hulls move through the dark like shadows. Warships trace familiar routes around disputed rocks and invisible lines on maritime charts. Coast Guard cutters, fighter jets, and surveillance drones weave through the same air and water, each captain convinced they are the one defending their nation's sovereignty, their people's dignity, their future. On paper, these are simply patrols, exercises, routine shows of presence. But anyone who studies this region knows the truth beneath the briefings. When vessels of two heavily armed powers pass this close, when radar screens are crowded and radio channels crackle with warnings, the line between routine and crisis becomes frighteningly thin. Japan and China are not just neighbors. They are two of the world's largest economies, two of its strongest navies, two countries whose histories are stitched together with conquest, suffering, rebuilding, and uneasy cooperation. Today, they are locked in a diplomatic crisis that stretches from the halls of the United Nations to the smallest fishing harbors in the East China Sea. Words fly, tariffs bite, ships shadow one another around islands whose names many outsiders still struggle to pronounce. Behind each headline lives a quieter, more human question. What does all of this mean for the families in Okinawa who live under the path of fighter jets? For the traders in Shanghai who depend on Japanese buyers? For the students in Tokyo and Beijing who dream not of war, but of partnerships, internships, shared laboratories, and a future where passports are used more for travel than for evacuation? And then comes the thought that chills diplomats and generals alike. If a crisis were to erupt over Taiwan, if a missile were to fall in the wrong place, or a ship were to collide in the wrong way, could these two powers find themselves sliding from tense peace into open war? Stay with us, this is more than a headline. It is a hinge in Asia's story. If this journey through Japan and China's uneasy relationship resonates with you, show your support with a like, a comment, or a subscription. It means more than numbers. It keeps balanced, nuanced stories alive. Part 1. Ghosts, Rocks, and Radar Screens. 1. Ghosts at the negotiating table. History in East Asia does not lie quietly in museums. It sits at the negotiating table. It whispers in school textbooks. It marches in protests. It appears in the language leaders use to speak about the past and to justify the present. In the last century, Japan and China were drawn into wars that left deep scars. For many in China, memories of occupation, forced labor, and devastation form a painful backdrop to any conversation about Japan. For many in Japan, the memory of catastrophic defeat, atomic bombings, and national humiliation created a determination never again to walk the road of total war. After the Second World War, Japan adopted a constitution that renounced war as a sovereign right. Its self-defense forces were designed in principle not for distant conquests, but to protect its own soil and seas. For decades, Japanese leaders spoke of pacifism, reconstruction, and economic growth, not military glory. Yet even in those years of rapid growth and rising living standards, the past never fully loosened its grip. Disputes over school textbooks, visits to controversial shrines, and competing narratives of wartime history periodically reignited anger. In each flare-up, nationalists on both sides raised their voices, and diplomats were left to patch together calm. Still, there were periods when the mood seemed to soften. Japanese investment and technology flowed into Chinese factories. Chinese tourists thronged Japanese cities, cameras in hand, filling shops and restaurants with new energy. Politicians spoke of friendship, partnership, mutual benefit. For a while, it seemed that trade and travel might gradually bury the worst of the old resentments. But history is not a blanket you can simply throw over the past and forget. It is more like a seed in the soil. If not handled carefully, it can grow again into something thorny and hard to control. In both countries, new generations learned selective versions of the past. Some voices emphasized reconciliation. Others whispered that honor had not yet been fully restored, that dignity demanded a firmer stance. So when new disputes emerged over islands and sea lanes, they did not appear on empty ground. They landed on a landscape already marked by unresolved feelings of injustice, pride, and pain. The ghosts of old wars were suddenly standing at the back of every press conference. And if the past still sits in the room, what happens when new weapons, new alliances, and new fears enter that same room? 2. Islands of stone, seas of steel. Far from the skyscrapers of Tokyo and the towers of Shanghai, the East China Sea looks, at first glance, almost peaceful. A blue expanse broken by small islands, scattered rocks, occasional fishing boats. On a clear day, the horizon seems calm, almost soft. Yet this calm surface hides one of the most dangerous fault lines in modern geopolitics. A chain of islands, some inhabited, some little more than cliffs rising from the sea, has become a symbol of sovereignty, a test of resolve, a place where coast guards shadow each other and navies practice operating in close proximity. Japan administers a group of islands it calls the Senkaku. China claims the same territory as the Diaoyu. Each side has its maps, its legal arguments, its historical documents, its sense of righteous ownership. For citizens taught that sovereignty is sacred, the idea of giving up such claims feels like surrendering a piece of national dignity. Around these islands, Chinese Coast Guard vessels and Japanese patrol ships conduct what both describe as legitimate operations. Radio messages crackle across the water, warnings to leave what each side views as its own territory. Legal phrases repeated in firm, practiced tones. The situation is often described as a gray zone, not quite peace, not yet open war, a place of constant pressure and constant risk. Further south and west, Japan has been strengthening its defenses on remote islands closer to Taiwan. New radar stations, expanded bases, and planned missile deployments are presented in Tokyo as a necessary response to a changing security environment, to the growth of Chinese naval and air power, and to the fear that any conflict over Taiwan would naturally spill into Japanese waters and skies. In Beijing, the same moves can be framed as encirclement, as a sign that Japan is stepping away from its post-war restraint and moving closer to confrontation. Above, in the air, fighter jets from both sides occasionally scramble in response to perceived intrusions or sudden drills. Each launch is explained in calm, official language. But for the pilots in the cockpit, for the families who hear the roar of engines overhead, there is always a flicker of unease. How close did they fly? How tense were those radio exchanges? How easy would it be for a misread signal, a malfunction, a moment of fear to tip into tragedy? Before we move on, there is something simple yet powerful you can do. Write a comment that begins with the word peace. It might be peace in East Asia, peace for the next generation, or simply peace over pride. These are not empty words. They are a quiet stand. When you add your voice of peace, you are not just engaging with a video, you are recognizing that behind every headline, there are lives that depend on calm seas and open dialogue. The irony is brutal. These rocks and waves, once of interest mainly to fishermen and coastal communities, have become a testing ground for national resolve. Patrols that once measured their success in fish and safe journeys now measure it in the number of incursions repelled, the number of days a rival ship has been kept at arm's length. How did a stretch of sea become a chessboard where every move feels like a test of pride? 3. Rivals bound by trade. For all the steel in the water and jets in the air, the relationship between Japan and China is not written only in military terms. It is also written in trade statistics, shipping manifests, tourist photographs, and factory assembly lines. Over recent decades, Japanese companies built factories in Chinese cities, chasing lower costs and new markets. Chinese firms imported precision components, advanced machinery, and high-end products from Japan. Supply chains wound back and forth across the sea, connecting ports and warehouses like unseen threads. A smartphone in Europe or a car in Africa might quietly carry inside it parts that had crossed between these two countries multiple times before reaching the customer. Chinese tourists have filled the streets of Tokyo, Osaka, and Hokkaido, snapping pictures of cherry blossoms, autumn leaves, and snowy landscapes. Japanese products, from electronics to animation, have found devoted audiences in Chinese homes. Students, researchers, and professionals have traveled in both directions, sharing laboratories, lecture halls, and offices. When politicians speak about sanctions, import bans, or travel restrictions, these are the people whose lives are immediately affected. Workers in a Japanese factory that exports to China, hotel staff in Beijing, whose guests are mostly Japanese, students who had hoped to study across the water for them. Diplomatic punishment is not an abstract tool. It is an unexpected empty booking, a canceled order, a dream delayed. This is where the story becomes more complex. On one hand, economic interdependence is often hailed as a guardian of peace. Two countries that depend on each other for jobs and growth, the argument goes, have too much to lose from war. On the other hand, that very dependence can become a weapon. Restrictions on seafood, on tourism, on high-tech components, or rare materials can be used to send political messages without firing a shot. When tensions rise, some voices call for decoupling, for moving production elsewhere, for reclaiming independence from a rival. Others warn that pulling apart tightly woven supply chains can itself be a slow kind of damage, a self-inflicted wound. The debate is not only about profit. It is about security, resilience, and the kind of world the next generation will inherit. When people look at a map and see Japan, Taiwan, on the same arc of islands facing China, they see more than lines of tension. They see sea lanes that carry energy and goods, digital cables on the seabed pulsing with data, and a web of trade that ties the fate of factories in Nagoya to consumer demand in Guangzhou. Now, let us turn this story into a shared moment. Write in the comments where you are watching from your city, your country, your corner of the world. BH Featured News will read them with gratitude, and we send to each of you a heartfelt wish. May your days be filled with stability, understanding, and room for dialogue. This is more than a video. It is a gathering of voices across the globe, all listening to the same waves of tension and hope. For all their rivalry, Japan and China have grown rich, in part by doing business with one another. They have built roads of trade together, even while arguing over who controls which rocks at sea. The question that haunts economists and peace advocates alike is simple, and yet deeply unsettling. How can two countries so deeply connected by trade stand so close to the edge of confrontation? 4. How a war could start. If you ask leaders in Tokyo or Beijing whether they want war, the answer is almost always the same: no. The cost would be catastrophic, the risks impossible to control. Yet history is full of wars that almost no one truly wanted. Wars that began not with a formal declaration, but with a chain of accidents, misread signals and political pressures that left decision-makers feeling cornered. In the skies and seas between Japan and China, there are many ways such a chain could begin. Imagine a fighter jet flying a little closer than usual during an interception, a pilot under pressure, a radar warning that comes too late. A collision at high speed is over in seconds, but the fallout can last decades. Or imagine two Coast Guard vessels jostling for position near disputed rocks. A misjudged turn, a damaged hull, sailors injured or killed. Cameras roll, images spread, anger rises. In such a moment, leaders face a cruel calculation. Do they respond forcefully, to show strength and satisfy domestic expectations? Or do they hold back, risking accusations of weakness? Nationalist commentators and social media voices can turn a single incident into a test of honor. A measured response may be wiser, but it is harder to sell to a public already primed to see the other side as aggressive. Then there is the wider theater that stretches beyond the immediate line between Japan and China. Taiwan, standing at the center of so many strategic debates, adds another layer of danger. If tensions around the island suddenly escalated through a blockade, large-scale exercises, or a crisis spiraling out of control, Japanese leaders could feel that their own security, their own sea lanes, their own citizens were directly at risk. Chinese leaders, for their part, might see foreign involvement as an intolerable challenge to their red lines. In the background, the United States watches and moves. Allied to Japan, bound by its own reputation and interests, it has forces based on Japanese soil and ships regularly traversing these contested waters. Any clash that involves Japanese and Chinese forces risks drawing in American units simply by proximity. A local incident can quickly acquire global consequences. None of this means that war is inevitable. But in a region where militaries operate so close to one another, where doctrines emphasize readiness and deterrence, where political narratives highlight resolve and determination, the margin for error narrows. The more often aircraft scramble, the more frequently ships shadow one another, the greater the chance that one day a routine mission will become something far more dangerous. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps planners awake at night. Not a carefully considered decision to begin a war, but a fast-moving crisis that outruns diplomacy, where every hour brings new risks, where each side fears that hesitation today will lead to weakness tomorrow. A ladder of escalation is easy to describe in theory and terrifying to climb in reality. A single misstep, a single misreading of intent, and the question may no longer be how to avoid conflict, but how to stop it from spreading. If the road to war can begin with a single misstep, is there still a way to build a different road, one that leads away from conflict? 5. Building a different road. The answer depends on choices being made now, not in some distant future. Preventing war is not a one-time act. It is a habit, a discipline, a series of small decisions that, over time, create guardrails strong enough to withstand storms. One of those guardrails is communication. During the Cold War, rival powers built hotlines, agreed on certain rules to prevent accidental clashes, and, at key moments, spoke directly, even when trust was low. Between Japan and China, and between other actors in the region, similar channels exist but are often fragile. Military-to-military hotlines have taken years to negotiate. Some have fallen silent during periods of tension, precisely when they are needed most. Strengthening and using these channels does not require friendship. It requires a sober recognition that miscalculations can kill. Agreements on how ships should behave when they encounter one another at sea, guidelines for aircraft operating close to foreign borders, procedures for clarifying incidents quickly, these are not signs of weakness. They are signs of maturity, of an understanding that dignity and restraint can live side by side. Another guardrail lies in diplomacy that does not only appear when a crisis erupts. Regular dialogues, regional forums, and back-channel conversations help create a shared vocabulary. Leaders and officials who have met many times before are less likely to interpret every move as a deliberate insult. Even in moments of sharp disagreement, a history of speaking can make it easier to pick up the phone rather than reach for a harsher response. Beyond governments, there are quieter forms of connection that matter more than they are often given credit for. Academic exchanges, joint research projects, cultural festivals, sister cities, business councils, these may seem small compared to warships and fighter jets, but they weave a different kind of net. They remind societies that the people on the other side are not only uniforms and flags, but students, parents, workers, artists, scientists. In both Japan and China, younger generations have grown up with far greater access to information about the outside world than their grandparents ever had. They can see, if they choose to look, how deeply their economies, cultures, and futures are intertwined with those across the sea. They are not responsible for the choices of governments, but their attitudes will shape the climate in which those choices are made. A public that insists on seeing only enemies leaves leaders less room to compromise. A public that understands the cost of conflict and values stability and cooperation gives leaders more space to pursue restraint. There is also a role for the wider region. Neighboring states in East and Southeast Asia, along with partners further afield, have an interest in encouraging transparency, dialogue, and practical cooperation. They too would suffer from disrupted trade, from refugee flows, from a fractured security order. When they invest in multilateral institutions and shared norms, they are investing in a future where disputes are managed, not left to fester until they explode. Peace in this sense is not a romantic dream. It is hard work. It is the endless task of building institutions, nurturing habits of restraint, correcting dangerous narratives, and remembering that true sovereignty is not only the right to defend one's territory, but the wisdom to avoid unnecessary war. These efforts will never make headlines as dramatic as a naval exercise or a diplomatic clash, but quietly, steadily, they can widen the narrow road away from conflict, step by careful step. Before we close, let us pause. What you have just heard is not simply an episode in foreign policy. It is a reminder that behind strategy and power, there are people who want to live in peace. If this message has moved you, then subscribe to this channel. Not because we ask for numbers, but because we are building a space where complex stories about Japan, China, and the wider region are told with care and balance. By subscribing, you are not just supporting us, you are choosing to walk with us into the next chapter of this unfolding story. 6. The choice that is not yet closed. So, could Japan and China really go to war in our lifetime? The honest answer is unsettling. It is possible, but it is not predetermined. The ingredients for conflict are present unresolved historical wounds, territorial disputes, growing military capabilities, fierce national pride, and an increasingly tense strategic environment. But the ingredients for a different future are also present deep economic ties, shared challenges, and countless individuals on both sides who quietly prefer cooperation to catastrophe. We began with images of warships in the dark, radar screens filled with blips, and officers making decisions in seconds. Yet the story does not belong only to them. It belongs as well to the factory worker whose job depends on cross-border trade, to the student who dreams of studying abroad, to the families who live under flight paths and along coastlines, wondering what the next decade will bring. When people look at a map and see Japan, Taiwan on one side of the sea and a vast mainland on the other, it is tempting to see only lines of tension. But those same maps also show shipping routes, undersea cables, and air corridors that have, for years, carried goods, data, and people between shores. The future of Japan, Taiwan, is not simply a matter of deterrence and defense. It is also a question of how they, together with their neighbors, imagine a regional order in which competition does not always mean confrontation. For China too, the choices ahead are not only about demonstrating strength. They are also about how to balance national aspirations with the need for a stable environment in which to continue developing, trading, and engaging with the world. A region locked in constant crisis is a region where everyone pays a price, in opportunities lost and futures shortened. The path forward will not be easy. It will require leaders to speak hard truths to their own publics, to resist the temptation of easy slogans, to remember that sovereignty and dignity are not strengthened by reckless risk. It will require citizens, commentators, and educators to resist caricatures, to admit complexity, to understand that patriotism need not mean wishing harm upon others. The sea between these countries will not grow wider. The ships will continue to sail, the aircraft will continue to fly, the islands will remain where they are. The question is whether the people who live around that sea will allow fear and pride to steer them towards disaster, or whether they will insist quietly, patiently, persistently on another course. The future of Japan, Taiwan, and China is not written in advance. It is being shaped, day by day, in policy rooms and classrooms, in dockyards and living rooms, in every decision to escalate, and every decision to step back. No single speech, no single video can change that trajectory on its own. But every voice that calls for understanding over hatred, for caution over bravado, adds a small weight to the side of peace. In the end, the most powerful question may not be, will there be a war, but what can we do, each in our own small way, to ensure that there is not?